Welcome, believers. Welcome, conspiracy theorists. Welcome to the wonderfully weird world of UFO aliens and weird stuff. Now, and I'd like you to introduce you to my UFO hotspot map, where we record sightings and stick them on the map of weirdness, right? But before we go any further, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Likes are really important and they help my content get noticed. So please like and subscribe if you can. Right, so then today we are going to talk about... Actually, before I go any further, I would like to say that I get all my stuff from UFO Insight. I used to get some of my stuff from it, but now I get all of it. Right? I really like it. UFO Insight by Marcus Lowe. Check it out. It is well worth the subscription. Tiny little bit of subscription. I've been a member years. Can't remember how much exactly, but it's cheap, right? So the barbecue abduction incident in Derbyshire, England, 1995, is a worthy addition to the UK UFO hotspot map, and there it is, right? Right, so give you some pictures of my map, right? So this is in Derbyshire, just under Manchester, and there is a few different sightings around that area, okay, especially police sightings. So the map is starting to fill up, isn't it? Now, ironically, one of the most detailed alien abduction counters is also one that is relatively unknown, because I didn't know about it until I stumbled on it. Even more bizarre, perhaps, and I do think it's bizarre, it would take place not like in the countryside, not on a quiet little road like the A70 incident near Falkirk or the Joyce Bowers incident in Winchester. No, this took place in a typical English housing estate. Now, let's tell the story, right? An evening of food, friends and alcohol would soon take a most dramatic and bizarre turn, leading UFO researcher Tony Dodd, and he gets his fingers in many pies, Tony Dodd, doesn't he, would investigate the case and through hypnotic regression would piece together one of the most bizarre and fascinating encounters in recent memory. Not only that, but the information put forward would prove strikingly similar to other such abduction cases that in all likeness the four witnesses would not have been aware of, okay? Now, were four people abducted from a barbecue in Derbyshire in 1995? Now, I'm going to say yes, right? So I am a massive UFO fan. I believe them 100%, right? My question is, I don't question whether they exist. I just question what they want. What are they doing there? All right, is it for our DNA? Are we hybrids? Is the Anunnaki theory real? Have they been knocking around for thousands of years? I'm just going to say yes. I think they have been knocking around for thousands of years, right? But, so if you believe in UFOs, you've got to believe in the abduction stories and also the cattle mutilation stories, even though they're horrible. All right, now these abduction cases have been going on for centuries, and there are so many when you start looking into them. And like you say, they all have a similar striking to them, you know? They all have a similar pattern. Now, I will tell the story then. A nice evening for a barbecue, right? The hot July evening in the summer of 1995 would present Mike and Debbie with an opportunity to invite their close friends and neighbours Steve and Annie, right? They come round for cold drinks and a last-minute barbecue. Now, needless to say, the evening would also present them with an experience as life-changing as it was terrifying, right? So it all starts shortly after 10 p.m. when Mike first lit the barbecue. Quite late for a barbecue, really, right? By 10:40 p.m, chicken legs, burgers and sausages were on the griddle. Each of them sat around a small garden table nursing a pint of, well, apparently, ice-cold cider. Not my favourite thing, personally, but that's your bag. I rather prefer a doom bar, but there you are, right? Now, quite literally out of nowhere, a huge round dish-shaped craft hovered over them, right? No more than 20 feet from the ground. Now, on the underside, bright white lights moving in an anti-clockwork direction would light up the garden. Now, it always amazes me, right? And I've got to say it first, right? This is a housing estate. I know they're neighbours, but what about the neighbours on the other side? Now, I'm not saying I don't believe this, because I do, but it just amazes me how people don't see anything. Or they're so stuck in their own little bubbles that they don't really interact with the outside world. That could be true, right? Or they might have just gone to bed and not even noticed it. Now, suddenly, a door opened in the dark metallic object, and a column of light reached down to the ground. Now, as it did so, all four of the witnesses will report how time seemed to slow down and their surroundings become dreamlike. Now, Steve would later recall, it was as if we had entered a vacuum. All sound seemed to have stopped and everything went into slow motion. Now, the craft then moved away, slowly at first, then with an increase in pace. Now, as they maintained their watch over it, so they're watching this thing fly away, all four began to feel an intense nausea and stomach pains. Now, this last point is particularly interesting, as many who report similar encounters also report such immediate symptoms, right? So there's a connection there. Now, Steve noticed the food on the barbie, right? That's the first thing he turned around. He's looked, and it was now cooling, and all the food had burnt to a crisp. Now, that made him check his watch, and it revealed it was approaching midnight. What they thought had been a matter of minutes appeared to be almost an hour and a half. So we got the classic missing time, haven't we? Now, Mike would make a report to the police, who would, believe it or not, appear to treat the matter seriously, right? Well, does surprise me, right? Taking statements from all four people, they would also check if items were missing from the property. Now, bizarrely, two of the pint glasses were and will remain missing even today, apparently. You know, maybe they nicked them. You know, maybe the aliens wanted a souvenir. You know, when you go to a pub and you see a really nice pint glass. Now, I've never done it. Never done it. But it somehow makes its way home, doesn't it, right? So it would be the police who would refer the case to Tony Dodd, right? Himself a former police officer. Now, utilising the experience of Joyce Dinsdale, all four of the witnesses would agree to hypnotic regression in an effort to unlock the events of that hot summer evening, right? And explain the missing hour and a half. Now, each would speak separately from the others, and each told the same story, roughly. Now, it starts, right? They noticed the light shortly after lighting the barbecue. Distant at first, and it would grow rapidly until it was practically on top of them, flashing as it did, right? Now, the craft was round with a dome structure on the top. The lights on the underside of the craft were so bright, it would almost blind them. Now, at this point, each of them stated that their next memories were of realising they were no longer in the garden. Right, so they've obviously been sucked up to the ship, right? Now, Debbie starts first. Debbie would state during regression how all four of them were in the garden enjoying the warm temperature of the early evening summer. She then recalled how she could see a flashing light. She would then recall how it was white flashing and it was flashing down towards us. She said it was then she started to get scared. She would further recall how there was something above us, something that was circular with bright flashing lights. She noticed that Annie, her friend, had also noticed a strange object and was staring at it in amazement and pointing upwards. This is what she's saying in regression. Debbie would go on to describe the object as round with a dome on top. Right? On the bottom, there were rotating lights of red, green and white. She recalled how the lights were so bright that they too were hurting her eyes. Again, a pattern, right? So, it was at this point in the session that Debbie began to become visibly distressed and upset. Now, however, after several seconds, she calmed down once more, right? She would then state that she's on her own. I'm not in the garden anymore. The light still shone brightly into her line of sight. I can see shadows, she would recall. I can see different coloured lights. I can see eyes looking at me. And she described them as big and black. And she says they're not like ours. She would then declare her realisation that she's laying on something hard with her back raised. She could see movement around her, but could only describe them as shadows. Now, Debbie would describe the roof of the room as being strange and coming down walls without a joining. Her description, right? She would then become even more upset and distressed to the point where the session was ended early. Now, Dodd would write that it had obviously unleashed too much trauma for her. So the regression session had upset her, right? Now, Annie, it's Annie's turn, right? When Annie gave her account under hypnosis, she would display the same intense fear and terror as her friend Debbie, right? She would describe how the craft was hovering above them, right? She says she would describe how the craft was hovering above them before an intense light came from the underside, lighting up the garden. Now, after the column of light touched the ground, she would state a small figure dressed in a strange black cloak with a hood appeared in the garden. Now, it's got a strange pale face with a pointed chin and very large black eyes. She would claim under regression 2 more of these beings appeared if out of nowhere. Annie would recall, they've got hold of my arms, they're dragging me towards the light. She also claimed that the beings appeared to communicate with each other by making strange animal-like grunting noises. Now, I'm not being silly, and I'm only making this up, right? Normally, if you get an abduction scenario, they communicate telepathically. Maybe those strange animal grunting noises were them straining to take her onto the ship. I'm only guessing, right? Now, perhaps interestingly, as she described being taken on board the craft, her nervousness increased. That's not interesting, that's obvious, right? However, similar to Debbie, as she then recalled being inside the strange room, she became suddenly calm. Now, this is a question, right? Might this have been the result of some kind of calming drug or medication that were given by their abductors? You know, did they drug her to calm her down, right? Now, the next thing Annie would recall, she was in a room with loads of people around the sides. They are, she says, little people. They are all wearing cloaks with hoods. What's unusual, isn't it, right? She would describe much of the same procedure as Debbie, including that the beings had 3 fingers and made a strange noise that left her unnerved. She further recalled that the entities were touching her face and pulling her hair and even removing her top. So she was obviously undergoing some sort of exam, wasn't she? Medical examination. She then suddenly recalled further details of the room. She described the walls as funny, round and divided into squares. I always say when I'm reading these that it's hard to understand, isn't it? Because they are under regression. Now, the light seemingly coming from the walls were, as she described it, peachy, she would state, and it continued to hurt her eyes immensely, even causing her vision to blur somewhat. So obviously the lights were bright. Now, it was at this point that her attention was brought back to the activity taking place around her. She noticed how one of them had a strange device in its hand that she described as a silver small square thing on a rod. She also noticed that another was scraping another instrument in between her toes. She was obviously going through some sort of examination, wasn't she? Now, Annie would recall that she could feel one of the strange entities injecting something into her neck, as well as doing something what she described as horrible to her belly button. I'll tell you what, though, maybe, you know, it's always around that area, maybe it's fetus related, because that's not unusual, is it? From all these abduction cases, they always seem to go, if it's a woman, for the fetus area, you know? I don't know, look. It's only a guess, right? Now, at this point, one of the creatures pulled its face much closer to hers. She recalled how it was really pale with long, black, slanting eyes. Then her attention was brought back to her torso, where she could feel something pressing down on her belly button. Now, As she recorded these procedures, she began to become increasingly agitated and frightened. She told of how it felt as though they were touching her all over her body. The next thing she knew, right, she was standing in the garden watching the craft turn into a mere speck of light in the distance. Right, so they've come back round. She's come back round now, and she's just watched the ship disappear. So we've had Anne's description, we've had Debbie's description. We're now going to go to Steve and Mike, right, the husbands. Now, Annie's husband Steve would recall similar details. He would even state that the night felt strange before he even noticed the strange lights coming down towards them. So he had a premonition that something was afoot, right? Now, as the object approached, he noticed how his wife was screaming at his side. He recalled how there were bright, flashing lights all around him before his mind suddenly jumped to him being inside the craft itself. Now, after describing the same scenario of the craft descending upon them as Annie and Debbie, he would recall being in a bright room with lots of small people. Like Annie, he would claim that these beings were wearing cloaks with hoods. However, he would go on to say they were like black tin foil, but not tin foil. Now, that is very similar to the Joyce Bowles incident in Winchester in 1977. Now, she saw a silver entity, and she described the outfit as being tin foil, but not tin foil. Got a connection there, haven't we, right? Now, Steve would state being in a transparent tube without seams, right? Which the small beings were all gathered around, looking in at him. He would recall his removal from the tube and being taken over to another room. He would describe under hypnosis that it's a very big room. I can see all sorts in there. I can see loads of little people moving around. Now, he says, remember, he's under hypnosis. They've got white stuff, like balls of white stuff in their hands. They're carrying it. I don't know what it is. He would also recall being on board on the wall. He would also recall seeing a board on the wall with figures of planets on it. Now, he says, I can see Saturn and Earth and all the other planets, right? Now, during this time, Steve appeared to be standing, although he couldn't move. Now, at one stage, he even believed he had been taken onto another much bigger craft. As he was stood, temporarily paralysed, the strange entities around him continued to pull and grab, seemingly performing experiments and tests on him. He was then back in the garden. He was then back in the tube at first. He believed he's on his own until he heard Annie screaming. At first, though, he couldn't see where she was. It was then that he realised he was stood looking up towards the strange craft, although it was motionless, so he was back in the garden. The lights underneath were moving rapidly. Now, he recalled how he felt as though he couldn't breathe and how he wanted to desperately stop looking at it, but something wouldn't allow him to do so. The tube thing, right? So he was then back in a tube. Now, if you recall the A70 Scottish incident that I told recently, and if you haven't seen the video, check it out, right? He was in a tube. Colin, the victim of the A70 incident, would state, from this scene, his memory jumped towards once more. Now, he's still naked. He was in a strange see-through container. It was, you recall, similar to glass or perspex, and he had his ankles strapped. Now, perhaps, though, the most settling image was other glass-like containers he could see all around him, each of which contained people. Now, this incident was 1992, so Colin from the A70 incident, right, the abduction incident near Falkirk, right, was in a tube, right, and when he looked around, he could see other people in tubes. Now, if we go back to what Steve was saying in this incident, he was in a tube. I don't know. Are they the same entities? Is it the same ship from 1992 to 1995? But we have got patterns forming, haven't we, right? Now, Then the craft began to move away from him. So we're going back to this story anyway. Giving off a green light. As it did so, he now found himself fully back in the garden. As he grasped for breath, he found himself back in the garden with Anne, Debbie and Mike, watching the craft disappear into the night sky. Now, Dodd would write how Steve became increasingly unnerved the further into the account he went. Now, although he would seemingly recover his calm upon coming out of hypnosis, as he was telling his story, he started to get a little bit stressed. Now, although Dinsdale attempted to regress Mike to recall his version of events, he became so terrified that they decided it would be unsafe to his mental health to proceed any further. Needless to say, this reaction alone shows that something alarming must occur that evening. So alarming that Mike couldn't deal with it. And to be honest with you, I get it. Right? I'll get that. It must be so terrifying. Now, since this article was first published, right, now this is UFO Insight talking, I received correspondence from a member of the investigation team who worked on the case with Dodd. Right, he would state that not only was the incident genuine and very credible, but many of the witnesses developed such mental abilities as apparent telepathy. It is not clear how this information was transferred to the investigator himself, or whether the witness had changed their minds regarding investigating the incident further. We do know, however, that many UFO witnesses, and specifically alien abductees, often speak of developing sudden psychic or telepathic abilities. Does this then does this lend the account a little more credibility? So this is from Marcus Lau, the author of UFO Insight. Someone's obviously contacted him and told him of a further development, right? It's certainly an interesting case, right? It is, isn't it? Right, and one that in the UFO community we mustn't let fall through the cracks and go into obscurity, because I've never heard of it, so I'm telling you the story. Remember it, man. Right, Derbyshire, 1995, and many more similar incidents might have taken place and gone unreported. How many similar incidents might have unfolded that still remain a mystery today? And I would say quite a lot, right? It's getting better. Right, but there's still, what would you call it? There's still, you know, if you report a UFO, you are still considered a little bit of a nutter, right? Not as bad as the 80s and 90s. We are getting better, right? Now, when we consider the notion of alien abductions against the sheer volume of claims, some researchers suggest over 1 million alien abductions happen around the world each year. We might wish to consider what the real purpose of such missions might be, and more importantly, whose benefit out of it, eh? Further encounters around the same time. There are similar abduction encounters that took place around the same time in the same, relatively speaking, location, right? For example, in early May, just outside of Glasgow in Scotland, a man named Igor Terzic was driving down a long, quiet road in the evening when an object suddenly appeared out of nowhere and hovered over his vehicle. The next thing he realised, he was parked right in the middle of the road with a truck heading towards him. He quickly snapped back to attention and moved his vehicle in order to avoid a collision. Terzic, however, had no memory of what had happened. He would, however, soon undertake hypnotic regression, which would reveal much more than he previously knew or suspected. And we will talk about that next week, right? We will talk about Terzic's incidents next week. Right, well, this was UFO Aliens and Weird Stuff. I really appreciate you sticking around. The map is developing. This was in Derbyshire. There it is, right? So next week we will continue and build up the case. So we have had some connections, haven't we? The tube on the A70 incident and the Derbyshire incident. Both were put into tubes. Both saw other tubes with other people inside. Was this the same UFO? Was this the same race? Or was it something totally different? We will never know, will we? But please like, subscribe and ding that notification bell if you can. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.